But first, facing up to big questions about the sort of country we are is inescapable now that the government has announced that 2024 is their preferred date for a referendum on this Indigenous voice to the Parliament. Now, like everyone, I'm keen to see more done to end Indigenous disadvantage, ensure that more Indigenous kids go to school, more Indigenous adults find work, and that Indigenous communities are safer. But these aren't the issues that the cultural warriors in our woke inner cities are focused on when it comes to Indigenous Australians. For them, history is the obsession, not the lives lived today by many Aboriginal people, particularly vulnerable women and children. I'm conscious of the fact that our country has not always treated Aboriginal people as it should, despite the instruction given to our early settlers as they landed in what's now New South Wales to try and live, and I quote, live in amity, so said the King, with our country's original inhabitants. But you don't address race-based divisions of the past by creating new race-based divisions today. I'm not one of those who says that Indigenous recognition is a distraction from bigger things, because I think as a country, we must be capable of handling several issues at once. And I'm not one to say that Indigenous recognition is unimportant compared to dealing with the dysfunction in people's daily lives, because symbols do matter. It's why I'm loath to change our flag or junk institutions that have stood the test of time. But this whole concept of an Indigenous voice to the Parliament is problematic, not just in process and practical terms, and I'll explain what I mean there in a moment, but also as a matter of principle. It's wrong in principle, dead wrong, to divide Australians by race. And it's a Rubicon that once crossed can't be rowed back. Once we're divided by race, we will forever have two classes of Australian. And once race is a dividing line, arguments will be mounted for other differences to separate us. Differences of gender or religion or ethnicity. And we therefore end up being a sum of what divides us as Australians rather than what unites us. But in practical terms, let me explain why this idea is poorly thought through. Who will be the Indigenous people that comprise this voice to the Parliament? How will they be elected? Who gets to vote? How does someone claiming to be an Indigenous voter qualify? And what might be the process for enrolling them? Which laws would be subject to deliberation by this voice? Would it be all laws or only those that uniquely impact Indigenous people? I mean, given our laws are supposed to apply equally, surely it means that every law go through our federal parliament would be second-guessed by the voice. And what should happen if the voice and the parliament are at odds? If the voice objects to something but the parliament votes to pass it anyway, what happens then? Should the relevant law be amended not to apply to Indigenous Australians? Wouldn't that then give us laws that apply or don't apply, as the case may be, to Indigenous Australians, but apply to everybody else? See the issue? My worry is that it's a bit like the United States in the South before the civil rights movement, where different laws apply to different people. Is this really what we want for our country? For instance, no one would say that Australians of Greek or Vietnamese heritage, for example, should have their own voice to the Parliament. But voice supporters argue that Australians of Indigenous heritage should have special say, and they argue it because they were here first. But hang on, does that mean that recent migrants are less Australian than others, or that ancestry should make a difference to people's rights? And if so, that overturns decades of being told that we're all equal in multicultural Australia, because citizenship, up until now at least, is supposed to confer equal rights on all. I'm not sure any of this has been properly thought through. And the more Australians come to understand what it involves, the less likely they will be to support it. I mean, what about Martin Luther King's justly famous exhortation that we be judged not on the colour of our skin, but on the content of our character?
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
What about that St. Paul's statement that went, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus"? I mean, what were church leaders thinking when they rushed to embrace the voice as they did last week? We've often argued, these days you have to be on the right side of history. That's what we're told. They urge that. But isn't the whole course of Western history to end discrimination on anything other than merit? Remember, this will not be an advisory body to the government on Indigenous issues. We've had plenty of those over the years. This will be a voice to the Parliament, and it'll be in the Constitution. Unlike the normally confidential advice to government, this advice from the voice presumably be public and presumably often at odds with the view of the government of the day. That's why critics such as former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull have likened it to a third chamber of the Parliament, because even if it doesn't formally have a veto power, like the other 2 chambers do, it must. Or what's the point of having it? One of the good outcomes of the election was the entry into Parliament of even more Indigenous MPs and senators. There'll be 10 in the new Parliament. That's a record. Indeed, Indigenous people will be overrepresented in the new Parliament compared to their percentage in the Australian population. With so many Indigenous voices in the Parliament, what's the rationale? What's the point of this separate Indigenous voice to the Parliament? Unless, again, the Indigenous voices that we've elected are somehow less valid than the ones separately elected by Indigenous voters only. Make no mistake, there'll be an attempt to railroad us all into supporting this voice. Opponents and even sceptics will be attacked as uncaring, divisive, out of touch, and inevitably it'll come that they're even racist. But it's not racist to resist new race-based distinctions in our Constitution. All of us need to look long and hard at this proposal and not let our natural goodwill to Indigenous Australians blind us to these fundamental questions of principle. Because once we divide ourselves by race in our Constitution, there's no turning back.